our next session really is, I guess, looking at verifying sustainability. So we've heard much about it, but how do we actually measure that? And I've also, just while I think of it too, don't forget those questions too. There was someone was worried they wouldn't get their question answered, but we will get to all the questions, some of which will be answered on a video. So there's a video going around, so if you've got your question, we will get to it. So keep putting those questions through on Slido, and we'll get to them. So yes, what can Australia's agriculture sector learn from its international counterparts when it comes to improving sustainability and those outcomes and reporting them? Where do the opportunities lie for our producers to lead, for example, or by example? And this session will provide a bigger picture of how Denmark has risen to the challenge of improving agricultural sustainability. And the panel discussion will talk about the opportunities of Australia and the technology that will not only enable that it will also help verify those claims and go beyond the mandated targets. So the case study is from Ben van Delden, who's from Deloitte, and Ben's a partner there at Deloitte in co-leading the Agrifood transformation and circularity practice. He's got 26 years of international experience as an advisor in the fields of agribusiness, food, natural capital, circularity, and decarbonisation, data and technology enablement. So a lot on his plate, but please, a big welcome for Ben. Cheers.
Thank you, Tim. It's a real privilege to be back here in Wagga. Thank you to Auntie Cheryl for the warm welcome back to Wiradjuri country. It's really a special place. I feel really charged when I come here, I know that. And to our Vice-Chancellor Renee Leon and your team, thank you very much for making the home of digital agri-food so welcoming for us all. It really is the place to be to come and talk about the issues facing our industry and, importantly, the opportunities. As Tim introduced, the conversation I want to have with you today is around the topic of sustainability and who cares and who's going to pay. And I think that's a really pressing topic when we're particularly facing some of the economic headwinds that we lean into today. If you sort of feel like 2024 has been the year of constant change, it is because it has been, for a couple of key reasons. Never before in the history of the world has there been so many elections occurring in a 12-month period. In fact, there's a very big one happening next week for the world's largest food exporting nation. So change is absolutely upon us. The markets that we import products from, fertilizer particularly, affected by the Ukraine-Russian war, the Middle East tensions are making the headlines all the time. Here at home, the economic impacts are felt significantly as people talk increasingly about food security. Not because Australia can't produce enough food, but because not all Australians can afford to access that food. Most local councils now have a food security officer to make sure people in their catchment can afford to eat. Producers in this audience will feel the effect as well as the cost of production goes up. Energy inputs, fertilizer inputs, labour costs, all driving pressure on margin. And at the same time too, the world, including our market here in Australia, is working harder to drive regulatory pressure on sustainability and climate disclosures and reporting and measurement objectives. Whether it's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directives out of Europe, as Richard mentioned, the deforestation regulations that are coming and have been embraced by some of our major retailers here in Australia, or the pressure on large Australian businesses to start reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions. It's all very real. And you would also see that leading to various levels of unrest across the agricultural landscape, particularly in Europe, where manure is not just spread on paddocks, it's also spread on ministers' houses. So we were thinking, what does all this mean to the average consumer? And so Deloitte set up a consumer signals report back in August 2022, right in the midst of COVID, just to track what does this compression on supply chains impact on food prices and how do people feel that at the till? What does it tell us? Australia is leading for all the wrong reasons. We are the most food frugal nation of the 20 countries that we survey. Every month, 22,000 consumers give us their viewpoint on what they are expecting they'll be able to bring home when they purchase their goods. We're at the wrong end of where we should be globally. And as a consequence of that, our consumers are having to make a number of choices to drive outcomes for their families. There are 6 core cost-saving behaviours that Australian consumers are exercising in the midst of these economic challenges. 30% are buying lower value, lower cost cuts of protein meat. 44% have lifted their food waste reduction initiatives at home, which is a great thing. And 23% are coming home with less than they wanted to buy. And unfortunately, that's gone up by 2% over the last month. So whilst we're seeing some downward trend in inflationary prices in recent months, we're still seeing significant food security challenges for consumers. So, sustainability, who cares and who pays? Does this mean that consumers don't care about sustainability anymore? Well, actually, that is not the case. When you think about your consumption, the one thing that you buy most often is food. And that is the category that consumers choose to exercise their sustainability muscle on first and foremost. On this slide here, which it might be a bit hard to see from the back of the room, it really echoes the comments that Mike Casey was making earlier today around how consumers actually care about the energy consumption that's going into products. It might be invisible to many of us, but the discerning consumer is looking for that information. In fact, on the 8th of December this year, the European wine labelling regulations are changing, and to such a level that there'll be a requirement to have off-label information relating to energy consumption going into the production of that product, amongst many, many other things. So consumers are taking a much more holistic view of what's considered to be sustainability when they make their product purchase choices. Importantly too, 4 in 10 consumers are concerned about the social responsibility of the brands that they're buying their product from. So it's about fair pay, it's about fair and diverse workforces, not just about sustainable packaging. So if that's the case, we ask ourselves, how will consumers expect to reward the food manufacturers for creating these sustainable attributes in their products? Will they actually pay? And can food companies make a profit out of doing so? Well, the answer is yes. We surveyed 350 global food and agribusinesses in March this year in partnership with New York University Stern Institute and asked that question: how over the last 3 years has sustainability driven results for your business? 99% of those brands and companies had reported revenue growth, and some 98% reported cost reductions. And so when you actually drill into that, some 79% got at least 2% revenue growth, but really interestingly, 14% got above 5%. And on the same end, over 20% getting above 5% cost reductions. So in agriculture, when you can lift your revenue and reduce your costs, you can dramatically improve your bottom line in a low margin business. So how do you do that? We unpack that with the input of the Stern Sustainable Business Institute to get to the bottom of what is the return on sustainable investment. How do you bridge the connection between sustainable policy and strategy with financial performance? And out of that, identified 12 key strategies for food and agricultural businesses. And you'll see some commonality between what the consumers are telling us is important about how you work with your employees, as well as care for the environment, linking back to some of the panel conversations that we heard before. So back to Tim's introduction, if those are the drivers that consumers are looking for from us, and there is an opportunity to profit from sustainability, how do we do it? we decided to take a group of Australian agri-food business leaders to a market that is considered a leading food nation in the world, and I just wanted to spotlight some of the insights that we've come back with from that tour. The nation that we chose to focus on is Denmark, a very small country. You can fit 1.6 Denmarks into Tasmania, a population of only 6 million people. A nation with a bold ambition when it comes to decarbonisation. Why? Because it has twice the level of contributed emissions from its agriculture and food sector than Australia does, with nearly 35% of their emissions coming from food and ag relative to our 17%. Why? Because they have a bold ambition to decarbonise. 70% emission reduction by 2030 versus our 43%, with agriculture and food taking a 55 to 65% emission reduction target to 2030. And because they're leaning into reform. There has not been enough decarbonisation in that market, so consequently government is stepping in and introducing a carbon tax on farming from 2030. All of this leads to some big challenges for industry. 3 key themes that we're going to unpack briefly. Decarbonisation and how are food companies working through the supply chain with their farmers to achieve that. The role of regenerative agriculture by these big brands and how they're supporting farmers on that transition, and the importance of giving the consumer the information that they want through climate labelling. Let's look at decarbonisation first. It's a really important topic that we're going to cover in a bit more detail on the panel to come. But when we were talking to these large companies in Denmark, the small nation with some of the top 5 food producing brands in the world, Arla, 4th largest dairy, Carlsberg, 4th largest brewery, Maersk, world's biggest shipping company, Danish Crown, one of the top 5 livestock businesses, they all said we're focused on carbon because carbon is a cost. So you can talk about carbon and decarbonisation for all the right sustainability reasons, but there's a really good business imperative to take cost and therefore carbon out of your business model. So how is Arla doing this? Arla is working with their supply chain partners to try and drive down abatement on farm. Why? Because they've set a sustainability target of 30% emissions reduction of on-farm emissions by 2030. It's an SBTI endorsed target. It contributes roughly 96% of their emission footprint, and the farming activity roughly 81%. It's not a whole lot different to our dairy businesses here in Australia. The progress that they were making was not keeping up with their ambition. They had set a target of getting down to 0.88 kilograms of carbon per kilogram of milk, so that's an intensity target by 2030. At 2023, they're sitting at 1.08 kilograms, so they're not there yet. Over the last 12 years, since 2015, they've reduced their emissions by 12%. They've got another 18% to achieve over the next 6 seasons. So going from 1% reduction per annum to 3% reduction per annum. This means they need to accelerate. To do that, they've developed an incentive model, 500 million euros a year that they put up, and they measure the performance of their farmers. All supply farmers have been baselined with an LCA model, developed 6 key attributes that they want to prioritise and incentivise their farmers through the Arla Farmer Head initiative. 80-point model. First year it was introduced, 49 points was the average score farmers got, and the next season it was lifted to 53 points. Why? Because Arla's working with their farmers to educate them on the abatement measures that work, and have extended this program with their retail partners. So now you have the food brand and the retailers collaborating financially to incentivise the farmer to do the hard work of abating on farm. Regen Ag, a very polarising title in this market, not so in global food markets. We researched the 79 largest global food and retail companies in the world. collectively with over $3 trillion worth of market cap. 2/3 of those businesses are mentioning regen ag as a priority in their procurement strategy, yet only 8% of them are contributing funding back up the supply chain to the farmers to make the transition. They're doing so not because it feels good, they're doing so because they connect nature positive with the challenge of climate. And they recognize as they work through these challenges that farmers need to transition. And the gap moving from an intensive conventional farming system to the adoption of lower intensity input, lower carbon input, more sources of natural carbon creation requires some support through that transition where traditional lending mechanisms don't allow farmers to take their foot off the input accelerator. We've seen a need for patient capital, a role for government, a role for banks, a role for retailers to step in and help the farming community in Australia address that challenge too. So how is Carlsberg dealing with this? In their 6 core goals of Together Towards Zero and Beyond, they've identified a zero farming footprint as a priority. That's not to say that they're not going to source barley from farms. That's to say that by 2030, 30% of their supply chain will be regen assured. By 2040, 100% will be regen assured. And what does that mean? It means a lot for barley producers around the world. This one brand buys 8% of the world's barley, and they're encouraging their farm suppliers to implement 3 rotational crops over 5 seasons. And if you're an Australian barley producer, that means thinking hard about new introduced rotational crops. Gemma Purcell mentioned earlier in the panel that we need to look at all the tools in our toolbox. And within the regen ag toolbox, there are many. Some work in Australia, some less so. But the point is we have to understand what the market wants from us and speak their language and meet their targets. So for Carlsberg, they've really connected the benefits to the environment with the benefits to the farmers. So recognizing that there can be some positive outcomes at an environmental level, there's also positive economic benefits, which creates sustainable supply chains. Consumers do care, as I talked about earlier. Sustainable food characteristics are different by different markets, and the important thing for us as exporters is to understand those unique differences. The Eurobarometer research indicates that there are some key priorities for Danish food companies, and they're a bit hard to see on the slide there, but the top 3 priorities are low environmental and climate impact, little or no pesticide use, and high animal welfare standards. That matters to Danish consumers. When you go to the supermarket, you see that present on their packaging. So the 3 hearts is the animal welfare score. On the milk product, the top red mark here is the Danish organic brand label. The next one is the nutritional label. Again, you see the animal welfare label, and then you see European Union made. But climate matters too, and 69% of Danish consumers are seeking information on the label of products about the climate impact that that product has. So a working group was established, and next year, 2025, the introduction of climate labelling on Danish food retailers. That includes imported products. So what we're going to see is a 5-category labelling system that will be applied using a national register where the attributed LCAs have been done for a range of core products, or you can undertake your own assessment and provide the rating based on the evidence that you've from the work you've done, the analysis you've done yourself. So what does this mean if you're an Australian exporter to Denmark? Be ready for someone to put a label on your product that says what the carbon intensity is. And not all things are equal, as you can see on this slide. And some of the big challenges that will be faced by the retailers is if the food manufacturer doesn't put the label on, should we put their product on a shelf in the supermarket categorized by that climate labeling system? Do we dare to take that information from the attributed LCA models and assign it to those products? they are going to lead with home brands. So you're going to see a major drive through the Danish market to adopt this climate labelling, and a lot of those big brands export to surrounding countries. So we're seeing this as a new trend that will likely come beyond the Danish border into markets through Europe and then trickle down to markets like ours. Also, they're rewarding their consumers with information and the detail to make better choices. So on their home ordering apps, not only will you know what the total cost of your shopping basket is, the VAT or GST, but also the carbon footprint. So information is helping Danish consumers make those decisions. So what next? And I know our panel is about to start discussing some of the big things that we need to start leaning into and doing differently in our market. I would suggest that as an industry, we need to accelerate our climate smart farming practices. We've got excellent examples here in Australia. We must do more. If we lifted the level of climate smart farming practice in Australia by 20% to 2030, Deloitte Access Economics suggests that that would contribute a 22% gross margin gain at farm level and add another $6 billion to our economy. We need to work better on supporting the transitional financing to help farmers through the heavy lifting that that end of the supply chain must do. And we need to improve the availability of data so it flows all the way through to the consumer and helps with the reporting obligation that's imposed. So data exchange support is really important to build that trust. And lastly, we must be better coordinated as a food industry. And I think we have every opportunity to connect food and ag around these big challenges. And so with that, I think I'll pass over to Tim and the panel to work out how we do that. Thank you very much.
Well done. Cheers. Thank you very much, Ben, for that. Just fascinating what is happening overseas and how it might pertain to us. It's always good to look at countries like Scandinavian ones often. Don't forget to put your names too on the slide of questions too. That's just one request from the people doing the data collation here. As was said there, let's drill down a bit into this topic. And the panel discussion, I've got Steve Capell. Steve's a member of the Australian delegation to the United Nations Centre for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business. Steve's been contributing to digital standards for trade facilitation for around 20 years. He's also a collaborator on the Ag Trace Australia initiative. Laura Grubb, and we'll get you to come up, Steve, as we introduce you. So coming up, we'll give a round of applause when they're all up here, so just hold your applause for the moment. Laura Grubb is a sustainability and engagement specialist with beef processor Greenham, where she works with 10,000 beef and cattle suppliers, global customer base and a dedicated plant staff to lead the continuous development of their sustainability story. Mick Anderson has worked in the environment and sustainability space for 20 years and as head of sustainability and agribusiness group GrainCorp. He's helping shape the delivery of their environmental, social and governance ambition. Tess Herbert from Gundamine Pastoral Company at Yagara has more than 20 years experience as well in the feedlot industry. And she's also got a keen interest in sustainability, both at a farm business level and industry-wide perspective, where she's also been chair of the steering group for the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework for 3 years. Welcome to the stage. And our moderator is Piers Hogarth-Scott, and he's a partner at Deloitte and co-leading the Agrifood transformation and circularity practice. And Piers operates at the forefront of digital transformation in the agriculture and food sectors, working as the trusted advisor to governments, research organisations and the private sector. And Piers, his focus really is on, across digital agri-food, circular economy, systems leadership, technology and data. So some really terrifically credentialed people. Please make them welcome, and over to you, Piers. Thanks, Tim.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here and welcome to the panellists. We're going to build on from Ben's keynote around sustainability, who cares and who pays. And in particular, the exploratory discussion that we're going to have with the panel is focused around Australia having a strong reputation on being a clean, green producer of agri-food products, but how do we communicate that onto a global stage? I'm going to ask each of the panelists to provide their perspective on the exam question, and then we'll move into a moderated Q&A, followed by some audience questions as well. So please do feed your questions into Slido, and we'll select those towards the end of the discussion in the next 40 minutes or so. So Tess, might start with yourself to provide some opening remarks.
Thanks, Piers. First and foremost, I'm a farmer and have been for about 25 years. Was originally a teacher though, and then childcare issues forced me back onto the farm. I just couldn't manage both. My husband and I built a feedlot, a cattle feedlot, with an intergenerational farm. Built another feedlot, then bought another one, but we now, after 20 years, we only own the one feedlot, but have extended our land holdings. In about 2009, I was shoulder-tapped to sit on a board for the Lot Feeding Association, and that began my introduction to industry policy. I now sit on the board of Meat and Livestock Australia, so I've had to switch my policy side of the brain off and just concentrate on marketing and research and development. But along the way, I also chaired the Australian Beef Sustainability Steering Group for their framework, and I'm now involved in the Grains Industry Governance Council for their framework as well. This discussion, and I put my hand up for this one as a late call, but is really interesting for me, not only industry-wide, but also on my own farms, and that's where I wanted to talk today about how I can take the industry knowledge that I've gained, but also apply that on farm.
Terrific, thanks. Thanks, Tess, and over to you, Mick.
Yeah, thanks. So Mick Hansen from GrainCorp. I also wear the hat as president of the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative's Australian chapter. And we had a conversation last week in Canberra around decarbonisation, and I'll draw on some of those insights today as well. GrainCorp, most people will know, obviously has about 180 grain handling sites across the east coast of Australia. I've been with the business for 2 years. I have been steadily working back towards the farm. Hopefully, Tess, one day I'll own one, but I started as a waste auditor. If you don't know what that is, I could talk to you at lunchtime and put you off your lunch. Working through government consulting and FMCG to gradually up the supply chain towards a farm, where I think there is the biggest opportunity to shift the dial when it comes to sustainability. Which then, the topic of this session around verifying sustainability gives me a perspective about why are we trying to verify sustainability, and what are the customers that are ultimately paying for Australian produce wanting to achieve and wanting to prove. And so I really see this as an exciting opportunity to create new commercial models for agriculture in Australia, where we can understand that a retailer or a branded company is trying to communicate to a consumer a particular credential, and we saw a whole bunch of insights around what consumers are desiring. And it's conversation about whether the retailer is prepared to pay or whether the credential exists and is worth paying for, is where I think verification comes in. So if we, as an agriculture sector, can package up credentials on climate, on nature, on Indigenous inclusion, on workers' rights, and present that to the market in a way that means when they want to make claims to shareholders or to the market, and we have ACCC and ASIC really excitedly there with the stick ready to go on any of those claims, they feel that they can trust that verification. It changes the nature of the conversation. And so we could talk with GrainCorp. Obviously we feed into the agri-energy market, and I'll just quickly give an insight from there about how important this becomes as the value of a sector increases. So used cooking oil and tallow are two of the sort of feedstocks that go into renewable fuels. We collect a lot of the tallow from Australia and the used cooking oil and send it across to the US to take advantage of regulations over there that drive value for our customers of supplying us tallow and used cooking oil. There are reports of ships of cooking oil going into countries coming out very quickly as used cooking oil, and there's a question around whether that has actually been used, but the value of that oil going into that market becomes attractive to try and game the system. And so as a result, there's now increased traceability requirements on that industry to be able to prove that that used cooking oil was picked up from mum and dad fish shop in Orange, obviously, where the best fish and chip shops are, and has gone through that system. And so I think when we look at this, there's two aspects to the verification: is the credential itself, and then the traceability and attribution of that credential to the end product. So I'll leave it there. Piers.
Great. Thanks, Mick. Over to you, Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura. I work for Greenham. So I think as described before, we're a beef processor. We have 2 plants in Victoria and another in Tasmania. And about 4 years ago, we as a company decided to put ourselves out and take the risk of doing exactly what this session says and verifying sustainability. So we created a sustainability standard, and we're working with our producers to be able to sell that as a marketable product as certified regenerative. So with that, we decided to work with producers and co-design a sustainability standard that would meet our customer requirements, that would mean our producers could actually get a premium for that product. As far as I'm aware, we're one of the only companies in Australia who's able to do that, and it's been a long journey. We officially launched in November last year. And so coming up to the 12-month mark, we've got over 150 producers that are currently selling into that program, and we've got demand for that that's outstripping supply. So we're a really great demonstration of the fact that this market does exist. As this evolves, we will continue to evolve as a company and evolve our standard, but we do believe it is possible to verify sustainability on farm and demonstrate what we're already doing as an industry in a way that customers can really resonate with that, and they're willing to part with their hard-earned cash.
Terrific, thank you. And Steve, you've got the mic.
Thank you. I have a day job as a consultant in Canberra, but I'm here today as Vice Chair of UN CFACT, which is a UN organization that has for 50 years or so been developing and publishing standards to support cross-border trade facilitation. A lot of things that you don't see but actually impact our daily life have come out of organizations like this. I won't go into them now, but more recently, aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, UN CFACT has been focusing on digital standards for sustainable and equitable trade. And most notably, a recent project called the United Nations Transparency Protocol, which is a project I'm leading, which aims to solve that problem, basically, of making verifiable sustainability claims visible across the entire value chain, from, let's say, from cotton farm to t-shirt, or from lithium mine to electric vehicle. What it is a protocol, a set of standards. Probably a good analogy would be telecoms or banking. All of us in the room choose a telecom provider and choose a bank, and yet we can pay people you have chosen a different bank or a different phone company anywhere in the world. But the same is not true of sustainability credentials and traceability information across value chains. There tend to be silos of technical solutions that don't talk to each other. So it becomes quite difficult to trace cost effectively from finished product back to primary production. What's missing is some interoperability standards, and that's what UNTP is. It's a generic interoperability protocol for sustainability information centered around a digital product passport, but with other bits and pieces to add trust and verifiability and traceability. But it needs, for it to be really applied in a particular context, it needs to be extended with industry-specific properties. So that's probably why I'm sitting here, because coincidentally, as we kicked off the United Nations Transparency Protocol, I also started working with AgTrace on how to do this in Australia and how to connect Australian produce as primary production all the way through to finished products in another economy. And are developing an extension to UNTP called the AATP, the Australian Agriculture Traceability Protocol. So a lot of acronyms and long words, but basically it's applying the UN standards in an Australian agriculture context so that sustainability claims with evidence are visible throughout the value chain right to finished product. Even in fairly complex supply chains, like, for example, livestock to leather seats in a Mercedes car. That goes through quite a few steps, but still feasible. So that's why I'm here, I think.
Terrific,
can
thanks,
talk more
Steve.
about
So as you can see, each of our panelists takes a different lens, if you like, to the agri-food sector, and particularly solving the challenges around sustainability. If we come back to the exam question that we're exploring today, it is that Australia has a strong reputation of being a clean, green producer of agri-food products, but how do we communicate that to a global stage? So if we pose the question, or if we recognise that Australia does have an amazing food and ag story to tell the world, but it's actually not as widely known or appreciated by international markets as it could be. And why do we think this is, and what should we do about it? Tess?
And I'm a real champion for these frameworks, so I'll go on a bit about them. But in 2016, I sat on the very first Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, chaired by Prue Bonfield. And then a few years later, after I'd left the Lot Feeding Association, I began to chair that organisation myself. I love the work of the frameworks. I've been in market in Europe meeting with the ambassador in Brussels, who said we use those frameworks all the time in free trade negotiations. And they're not widely known. We have extensive stakeholder engagement for those frameworks for a range of stakeholders, not just industry, but it includes anyone who has a question about what the Australian beef industry does. And there's a lot of questions about what we do. So that's part of the reason why these frameworks started. The dairy framework was first off the rank, I think, as a commodity framework. Beef followed hot on their heels, learned a lot from them. Sheep have done their framework. Grains are doing theirs now. I know egg and I think chickens are doing theirs as well. These frameworks are customer facing. So they're not consumer facing, and they're not necessarily for industry reporting, but they are on behalf of industry to show our credentials. In the beef framework, there's 50 data points, and they're national, and they show what I like to call verified story. In ag, we keep getting told to tell our story. That's great. But if you don't have something sitting behind that, you're in trouble. And I'll use, Richard used the phrase before, greenwashing or green hushing or whatever you want to call it. But if you don't have that data underpinning that, then you'll be caught out. It's not just about telling your story and marketing. It's about proving it as well. That's what I think Australia does extraordinarily well. That we have these frameworks that can prove what we do. And we have a whole lot of, particularly in the red meat industry, and that's my lens for the time being, a whole lot of systems that underpin the work that we do. And these are national systems. And when I travel globally, they are the envy of the rest of the livestock sectors in the world, particularly our national standards around traceability, using National Livestock Identification Scheme for cattle, being introduced for sheep nationally as well now. So all of those schemes underpin what we do, and it's a method of proving what we say we're doing as well. We do have, most people don't necessarily want to know the detail of what you do. It's like, I don't really need to know exactly what sits behind in my car engine or my phone. I just want it to work. So they trust us in the first instance to do it well. And if you have those shared values and trust, then we need to build on those. But again, we need something underpinning those, and that's the data. And to be honest, ag tech will help us get there. That's the biggest tool we have to help us get this data. So things like AgTrace or the system, the platform that Greenhams are using, or even a national standardised platform will help us get there. People have a little knowledge about ag, and that may be enough if they trust us, but we still need that data underpinning that.
Thanks, Tess. And Mick, what do you think we should do about telling our story to the world?
Well, first, I absolutely concur that there is a great story to be told. I'll tell a slightly embarrassing story. A few years ago, I was at the Global SAI event in near Chicago. Visited a farmer there that was the poster child for regen ag, to the point that he'd almost been excluded from his local community because he was doing this radical behaviour, this thing called minimum till and stubble retention. And I was, we should be doing this in Australia. And so I came back, I wasn't working for GrainCorp at that time, to find out that we've got 95% adoption rate here. And so when they're talking about regen ag, they're talking about things that are widely adopted and just standard practice in Australia. And so we have an opportunity to tell that story. I agree with Tess, there's an industry level articulation of that for trade, and then there's a farm level story that can be told as well. One of the, I think, the interesting dynamics here is if you design something that is perfectly suited to Australian conditions or your regional conditions, you then have the task of trying to get your destination markets to recognise that scheme. If you want to sell to a destination market that already recognises a scheme like ISCC and you demonstrate compliance to that, you don't, yes, it might not be as well suited to your farming practices, but you've got that access much easier. And so there is, I think, this customisation versus what you're trying to achieve with that certification, that's an interesting dynamic as well.
Yeah, absolutely, well said. Laura, any builds?
Well, we are a predominantly export business. We export probably about 80% of the product that we produce. And so this is a conversation we have day in, day out with our customers. Firstly, they're fascinated by Australian agriculture because with our biggest export market being the US, they have nothing very similar to that. So this is a whole learning experience for them. And so they're coming in with a very different perspective of what agriculture means. So it's actually about breaking down those walls and telling them about Australian agriculture. So that's step one. The other step is talking to them, as Mike's saying, in the terms that they understand. So we actually went to our customers and said, what would actually resonate with your consumers? And we time in, time out, got regenerative. That's the new area that consumers are looking for because it combats, as Tess is saying, the greenwashing aspect. Consumers are exhausted of environmental claims. They fundamentally distrust them. And so we're needing to produce an outcomes-based solution for them, which resonates as regenerative agriculture. So we're needing to tell that story, and as we're finding with our producers, is they're doing 80% of that as their day-to-day practices anyway. This is not new in Australia. We're very good at being sustainable. We're really good at working with our land by nature, and sometimes it's just tweaking on how we do it or documenting what we're doing and able to tell that story. And that's the biggest issue we have. We're really busy day to day on farm, and being able to kind of put that in a way that we can demonstrate to a consumer that we're doing the right thing, that is fundamental.
Yeah. And Steve, what about your work at the UN, particularly around standards and the role that has to play in helping to communicate a cohesive story?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I agree with the panelists that my limited knowledge of agriculture, it does seem that Australia is well positioned with a very well governed agricultural sector and some natural advantages like plentiful sunlight for renewable energy and so on and so forth, to be well positioned to meet the changing demands of export markets. So basically keep doing what you're doing and continue doing it a bit better, but just communicate it, right? And make it verifiable is a key message. But to do that, you've got to have an incentive to do it. You've got to be paid more for it or something like that, right? And I think we're at a tipping point driven by regulation that is a consequence of greenwashing, right? The various surveys that the European Commission have done and our own ACCC have done reveal that over 50% of sustainability claims on products are either misleading, deliberately misleading, or plain false, right? And that's what's driving the regulatory action to change these kind of claims from marketing department to operations department and put legal risk associated with them, right? All the regulation is whether it's a product level transparency through digital product passports or corporate level disclosures, it's basically saying to companies, state your performance, but state it not in a marketing speak, but in a legally accountable, verifiable speak, right? And that's changing, I think, demand from our customers in other markets who previously might pay a bit of lip service to sustainability claims, now want evidence. Because the regulations, particularly in Europe, the due diligence regulation is a kind of guilty till proven innocent type regulation, right? You have to, European market entrants have to satisfy themselves that they have done sufficient due diligence, which means not just accepting claims on face value, but getting evidence. And I think Australia is well positioned to just instrument what it's doing today, provide that verifiable evidence to be quite successful in export markets. But I think that I'm not yet seeing. We're just at a point where everyone's increasingly aware of this legal obligation and this transition from marketing to operations. But is it translating into a price premium? Is it, are producers going to get paid more? We're just at the early stages of that. And I think the answer is sometimes, but not often enough. And a key challenge is to push that premium right back to the primary producer and provide those incentives, right? And I think you do that through trustworthy data and evidence, and the large corporates demanding it. People spoke about Scope 3 emissions, for example. There was a slide up there, can't remember which company, where 96% of its emissions were Scope 3. So that's the emissions associated with the stuff you buy. And if you think about it, the further you are down the value chain towards retail, the bigger your Scope 3 compared to the rest of it. And so a lot of large companies who are doing corporate disclosures today, or just beginning to do corporate disclosures, don't have a handle on their Scope 3 emissions, so they guess them. Right? They use industry averages. I sell so much beef a year, industry average, I think it's 13.5 tons per ton. So there's my footprint. But how do I then improve my corporate disclosures next year if I don't have the levers to choose supply, because I'm not getting information with supply? So I think if it does turn out that the market starts to punish corporates that don't improve their year-on-year sustainability disclosures, then that'll drive a very strong demand for evidence at product level, because I need to be able to choose this lower intensity supply over that one, which I can't do today because it's just industry averages. Then I think we'll see price premiums, and we'll see behaviors, and we'll see those incentives start to flow. So I think Australia is well positioned to leverage those incentives, and now is the time to start instrumenting so that we can enjoy that advantage, because it will come, I think.
So it sounds like we're doing some great work in developing standards, frameworks. Individual organisations have a well-articulated narrative, if you like, to communicate to the outside world. But I would suggest that as a nation, we're probably not very cohesive in our ability to actually communicate that narrative as a nation to the world. Much like, there are some markets like Denmark that Ben was referring to earlier, New Zealand and Ireland, who are much more effective at telling a cohesive story. And in part, I think that's driven through the federated nature of Australia, if you like, the nation that we're in. We have 7 or 8 departments of ag. We've got a population of some 26 million people, yet we have 40 universities. We've got 15 RDCs. And so on and so forth. So we are by definition quite fragmented compared to other arguably more progressive agri-food markets such as Denmark. So I'm interested to understand what the panel feels we could potentially do differently, or what we need to change to drive a cohesive message or cohesive narrative on a national basis into the world. Would anybody like to have a first stab at answering that question? Or I'll pick on people. Tess, I can see you're agitating.
There is an argument for the brand Australia, particularly in agriculture, and there is an overarching Australian agricultural sustainability framework. But I'll be honest, most trade negotiations happen on a commodity-based level. So, and look, per commodity, that's where the hard work gets done, right down into the detail. And on farm, that's where the hard work gets done. So I think we're layering the conversation here. So from my perspective, I'm talking about a framework that addresses national issues that our stakeholders and customers have come to us with, and how that can be market facing. Steve's talking more about a UN whole of market perspective. And I also want to talk about the work that we do on farm, not necessarily in response to this question as well, but I think the image of Australia agriculturally is pretty good. There's work to be done, particularly around, and I'm going to say the word deforestation, and there are some others in the beef industry that crop up every now and then. So I can see Phil here. We worked in Meat and Livestock Australia, worked with on the beef sustainability framework with SIBO Labs on the balance of tree and grass cover as an indicator. And look, by the time you find that data, you can see that that actually shows you gains and losses over time. For those, I think there were 2, maybe 4 indicators showing gains and losses. But that can very quickly be communicated to your stakeholders once you've collected that satellite data to show where that is happening. So it just shows you how these sorts of initiatives can also drive R&D on the ground and practice change on the ground. Once people are using, they can log on now, can't they, Phil, onto their own properties, and they can see their own woodland and forest cover on there, so they can measure that as well. So if they then get asked questions by, look, one supplier that I supply has a deforestation target. So if they get asked questions by them, I'm just emphasising how good our systems are. So every red meat producer can access that. Is that right, Phil? Yeah. Can access that data to prove to their supply chain down the track. Now, I'm not sure of anywhere else in the world where this is happening. So I think that's the stuff we need to talk about, how good our systems are and how good our ag tech is at supporting these new initiatives. That doesn't mean there's not a long way to go. And I absolutely agree with Mick that we need to couch our conversations in an Australian perspective, because our landscape and our production systems are different to our export markets, and 70% of our red meat is exported. We also need to talk to our domestic market. In red meat, they're actually our single largest market. I think 30%, that rest of the 30% is our domestic market. So we need to be talking to all of our markets about the incredible work that we're doing to position Australian agriculture. I'm a food producer, I'm a fibre producer, but I'm also a custodian or a steward or a manager of the land that I'm on. And that's the interesting part that I think Australia is now grappling with. How do we position ourselves as land managers and custodians, particularly around natural capital? Because, as Natalie pointed out, 55% of the land in Australia is managed by farmers. So that volume of land and how heavily Australia identifies with rural and regional and remote communities and agricultural production needs to be an emphasis in whatever that brand Australia might look like. So I agree we need maybe possibly a brand Australian ag, but at the same time, let's keep doing the hard work in each commodity, because that work can't stop.
Yep. And Mick, your perspective on what we need to possibly change to have a more cohesive narrative to international markets?
Clearly agree with Tess. I think all of Australian agriculture, we're very good at pot shots against other commodities within agriculture, and the net effect of that is to bring all of us down, rather than what Tess has done is highlighting the good things. And at the SO event last year, we had one of Sue McCluskey's team there who heard from all of the various industry sectors about how wonderful we were, and saying, well, that's not what we hear when we go over and talk about Australian wool or grain or beef or milk overseas. And so I think being able to have these tools that demonstrate actually, this is the perception around deforestation or animal welfare, and this is the real life experience in Australia, I think is really important. The examples that have been used around Ireland, Denmark in particular, they had their own burning platform to come up with that. So the food industry in Ireland was on its knees, about to implode. They came together to create this thing. You look at what's happened in the Netherlands by not addressing sustainability issues in a very similar agricultural environment. So you can see the benefit of the whole industry coming together. The extent to which all of ag helps with commodity-based trade is a question for others, I guess. Yeah.
Yep. Laura, Steve?
I think to not reiterate everything again, but I think the biggest part we need to keep solving as an industry is the availability of data. We have customers come to us on a daily basis asking questions about our producers, and it's actually really hard for us to be able to provide solid data. At the minute, we rely a lot on the ABSF and the data that they're able to collect, but that doesn't necessarily reflect our supply chain. So that's something that we're working to address as a business, but we actually as an industry need to be able to open that up and have that transparency from every stage of that animal's life or every commodity, which is where these kind of AgTrace UNTP programs are really, really important. And it's something that is uncomfortable in the industry, and we're all uncomfortable, every part of the supply chain, in sharing that data. But we need to kind of lean into that uncomfortableness and start changing the way we think about data. It's actually really empowering, and it's going to get us a lot further ahead than just talking about what we do and hoping people believe what we have to say.
Yeah, it's not just availability of data, it's mutual recognition of some of the sustainability criteria, right? One of the challenges the world will have is a mountain of different standards and regulations covering more or less the same topic, different ways of measuring carbon, different ways of measuring, scope 3 boundaries and all this. So how do we, when we follow our fairly well-established, well-governed processes and come up with credentials for that, get those recognized by a market that has different rules, right? I think my observation is that European markets and some others are some way ahead of Australia in a government and regulatory sense in the way they think about this sort of thing. Somebody spoke about free trade agreements and the like. Today, our tariffs are, 5%? We're really dealing with sort of exchange rate fluctuation level discussions when you're negotiating free trade agreements around tariffs. But at the same time, we've got enormous non-tariff barriers emerging. If you calculate the value of a carbon border adjustment mechanism using the European unit price, which is 90 euros a ton, not $30 a ton here, and ask yourself, what would, if that tariff, that carbon border adjustment mechanism was applied to Australian beef, what percentage would it be of the value of the beef? My back of the envelope calculation is about 100%, right? So this is a vastly bigger tariff or opportunity than the little 5% negotiations. And yet I think our regulators and Austrade and the like are maybe a bit too focused on traditional free trade agreements and not enough on mutual recognition of sustainability criteria and the opportunities, and changing the thinking of government-to-government relationships from negotiations, from trivial tariffs, they're almost not worth the time you spend on them, to negotiating these kind of mutual recognition of sustainability criteria to give us market access based on the stuff we're already doing. I'd be looking at that, I think. And you're right, it's difficult because we're a federal organization, we are fragmented, but I don't see enough leadership in that area compared to what other countries are doing.
Yep. We have time for just one or two questions from the floor. And as I review the list here, there's one here for you, Tess, specifically. And should the framework that you're referring to earlier be converted to verifiable data for brands?
It can be. We always, when we used to present on the framework, we always identified what it is and what it wasn't. So there was a genuine fear in industry that we would make people use these standards on farm. That's not what it's for. It's to answer questions from stakeholders about what we do in animal welfare or the environment or people and the community. So the fair pay conversation that was up on a slide before. So it's not an on-the-ground verification system, but the good thing is that industry went and did this work And the red meat industry has been particularly good at this. We've had a carbon neutral target, and there's a person in this room who set that target in 2017 from memory. So very early on we set that target. The industry's been really good and proactive at getting in and doing this work. Different companies can adopt it, the principles, if they like, but that's not necessarily what it's for, but absolutely they can do that. And I think Greenham's did exactly that and started off, but it triggers your thinking about sustainability and what you can measure and you can't. So companies have done that, exactly that, but they don't have to. No one has to. So, yeah.
Yep. And one final question, and this one's probably for you, Mick. Given Regen Ag doesn't have a certification process or a robust definition, at least not one that's agreed globally, do large ag companies like it as a greenwashing exercise rather than a material change?
Ooh, that's a good question. No, we don't like it as a greenwashing exercise. Let's just cut that very clear. Through SAI, we actually did some research last year on exactly this, of looking at the state of play of Regen Ag, looking at all the different people that are claiming that their scheme or system is regenerative, and what's common and what's contradictory, and not necessarily saying who's right and wrong, but just getting that lay of the land. And I think the global Regen Ag framework out of SAI is a pretty good balanced approach, which is saying, there's some key outcomes that you would expect from regenerative agriculture around nature, climate, soil, and water, and they're fixed. How you measure those outcomes is a little bit of variability, and the practices that you would adopt in a particular farm, in a particular system, is completely variable, and you can't codify that at a global scale. And so that way, if you are trying to claim that you're regenerative, you need to demonstrate that you are doing some practices and you're measuring an outcome that's aligned to those four core things. And so I think we can get to a point where some of the angst comes out of the term and we actually move back to the fact that it is not that dissimilar to conservation ag, sustainable ag, and these other things, but it does help define that we're trying to improve on those outcomes. So I don't know if that's taken some of the heat out of that term in the room.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think that concludes our panel session. Thank you very much, Steve, Laura, Mick, Tess. Please give them a round of applause.